Hello,
Brianni,
Matthew. How are you doing?
Brianni, it's been so long.
I know, right? It's been a long
How
time.
are,
How have you been?
doing great. How are you?
I'm good. You would be surprised how sunny it is today in Belgium.
I would not. Well, it's going to be rainy here in Ohio, but that's good to hear. Sunny day.
Matthew, thank you so much for being here today to talk to me. It's a pleasure to have you here. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you?
Certainly, it's a pleasure for me to be here. I really appreciate it, Ronnie. It's one of the topics I really enjoy talking about. Well, one of the most, pleasure I get is talking a little bit about myself and then about the book. So it's a perfect interview. So I have been in the speech writing and speech coaching business for many years. It started out on Capitol Hill. You may or may not know that. I came out of college, started working with Leon Panetta, actually, member of Congress. Didn't do a lot of speech writing then, but did some speech writing and a lot of communications work right out of college on Capitol Hill. Then I started working doing more speech writing for the majority leader and the Speaker of the House of Representatives at the time was Jim Wright from Texas. So I've done speech writing since my mid 30s, or actually mid 20s. And then I got into the corporate arena. So first politics, and then got into corporate speech writing with a series of CEOs and some big companies. So corporate speech writing and some speech coaching along the way. And then I started writing some books, and there's a kind of interesting story I can get into about why I got into writing books and self-help books in particular. We can talk about that, how I made that transition. And then of course, we know each other because I worked at NATO, and I was writing speeches there for the Secretary General and other leaders at NATO. That gives you an idea, a lot of speech writing, some speech coaching along the way, and some authorship of a couple of. Plus, interestingly, the first book I wrote and was published was the Almanac of Transatlantic Politics. And then I followed that up with the Almanac of European Politics, which was in the early 1990s. So a bit of a long career in writing, speech writing, authorship in those domains. And then you are familiar with some of my workshops. I do workshops on public speaking, which I really enjoy doing.
That's impressive. That's amazing. Yes, I remember participating at your workshop at NATO. That was 2019, right?
Might have been 2018. Yeah, probably 18, 2 years, probably a little over 2 years ago.
19. Yeah, it was amazing. I was so like, it was very interesting because some of the things that you mentioned, I've never thought about public speaking the way that you were talking about. So it made me really reflect and actually rethink about what is public speaking? How do we communicate to the audience? And I thought that was so powerful. And your book that you gave it to us, I read it. I was like, wow, I have so much to learn. So it was great. I learned a lot.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And now, of course, there's a new book, an updated version of the book that you have, which I have a copy right here. You probably have seen the cover, and it's called The Joy of Public Speaking. And we don't need to talk all about the book, but certainly we'll delve into what do I mean by the joy of public speaking, and why is that important? And I really think that when I look back on the people who I think did the best job in speaking to audiences, it turns out it's the people who really enjoy doing it, who tend to do it better, just like any other thing that you do in life. If you enjoy it, you're probably better at it, whether it's painting or sports or playing the piano. If you really like it, if you really get joy from it, you're probably better at it. So how do you get joy out of public speaking? And I really wanted, with the title, I wanted to get people's attention, because as you know, there is trepidation and there's fear most people have some fear of public speaking. It's not just a small sliver of the population, it's a majority. Some people say that it's right up there with other fears, like things like snakes and spiders and death. There's public speaking right up there as one of the top fears that people have. And so I try to come at this from the point of view of trying to understand what it is about speaking to audiences that people are afraid of. And again, we can get into some of the specifics that I cover in the book, but just as a preliminary matter, I would just say that people speak without fear all the time. People speak to one another and they don't feel the same dread or stage fright that they sometimes feel in front of an audience. So that's a clue for me that it's mental, that there's a mindset about speaking to audiences that I wanted to address in the book and in my workshops. And some of the points that you thought were pretty powerful in the workshops, I think some of those points stem from the fact that there's an inside game and there's an outside game. And I cover both of those in the book. There's an inside job about your mental state of mind, basically about public speaking and what it is that you can do to change that, shift the mindset. So I love talking about this. So let me know if you have any more specifics or just tell me if I can just keep talking.
Yeah, so here I have two questions that comes to mind. The first one is, when did you discover your passion for communication and public speaking? And my second question is, what do you believe to be the key elements to become a good and successful communicator?
Right.
Have any practical tips of what we could do to become a good public speaker?
Right. Well, those are great questions to set this up, and I have thought about what it is. When did I first get interested in this? And because it seems to be something I've always been interested in, but I think somewhere around my high school years, I had always been interested in English and writing, but somewhere in my high school years, I came across a little bit of the biography of someone named Ted Sorensen, who was a speechwriter for John Kennedy, the president of the United States. And this is after, this was later on, but I remember hearing about Ted Sorensen and thinking, well, that's fascinating. Here's a speechwriter. I didn't really know much about, how people had in high offices had speechwriters. And so I began to learn a little bit about that. And he was more than a speechwriter. He was also a counselor, an advisor. And I thought, as I looked at my own future, I thought, well, that's a pretty good model to be someone who writes speeches, but is also an advisor. So Ted Sorensen was a bit of a model, an inspiration, I guess. And to fast forward a couple of decades, I actually had an opportunity to meet him, Ted Sorensen, and it was at a lunch for speechwriters in New York City. And I sat right across from him at a little table, and I was able to tell him how he was such an inspiration for me to get into speechwriting. And he seemed to be moved by that. He seemed to be touched. But it's nice to be able to tell someone who inspired you that he was your role model. And I never quite reached his level of fame, of course, but with the president of the United States. But he was quite funny. He actually spoke at this event, and he gets a question. You can imagine, your audience too could imagine. He often gets a question about how much of the inaugural address, John Kennedy's inaugural address, he is responsible for. In particular, what about that famous question, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, which is a moving quote that people remember about that inauguration speech. And so he's asked that at this speechwriters gathering. He was asked, did you write that? And his response, which is, he says, he always says this, I always tell people when I'm asked that question, ask not. So ask not. He doesn't want to answer the question. He never answers the question, did he write that famous line? Because he didn't want to steal the fame from John Kennedy. So ask not. So that was that's one of the things about being a speechwriter that you learn, is that you try to stay in the shadows as much as possible. You don't become famous as a speechwriter. That has changed a little bit over the years, but for instance, at NATO, yes, I can tell people I wrote speeches for the Secretary General. It's not a secret, but you don't really go out of your way too much to take credit for a particular speech or a particular line in a speech, like Ted Sorensen never took credit for that great quote from the inauguration. So my interest in this goes way back many, many years. And I was lucky enough to, after college, go into the political world where there are a lot of speeches made. And I started to write speeches. I was invited to speak at a speechwriters conference about writing a big speech. What is it like to write a big speech like at the Detroit Economic Club or some other big venue? And it's not a profession that people necessarily set out to do. It's kind of an accidental profession to be a speechwriter. You find that you have a little bit of a gift for it, and that's what I found along the way. That when I was asked to write a speech, that I guess I did it pretty well, and I was asked to write another one, and then pretty soon I became a speechwriter, and and a speech coach. I sort of got into that as well. I actually like doing both a lot. I almost prefer coaching, because then you have this one-on-one connection with somebody attempting to give a speech, and you can comment on and hopefully perfect and direct and make some suggestions about how a line should be delivered and some of that. That goes a little bit to your second question about some tips about becoming better at this, better at public speaking. And as I say in my workshops, and you'll remember this, one of my maxims, one of the things I like to tell people is that there's no such thing as public speaking. There's just speaking. So even though I use the title in the book, The Joy of Public Speaking, because that's what everyone thinks of it as, public speaking, I really encourage people not to think of it as public speaking. It's just speaking, it's talking, it's having a conversation. And I think that the label public speaking raises the terror alert. And I like to lower the terror alert by saying there's no such thing as public speaking. There's just speaking, having a conversation. And that gets back to this idea that we all speak to friends and colleagues and family members and people, even perfect strangers. We all, speak to people every day, and we don't get all nervous about it. We don't experience the same sort of stage fright that and the trepidation that we often associate with speaking to audiences. So what is the key? How do you change the mindset? And so I've come up with what I call 7 steps to joy. I don't think we have time to go through every one in detail, but it really begins with always thinking about and always speaking to the audience as an audience of one. Don't ever think of an audience as a vast group of people, 100 people, 10 people, thousands of people. I really think that the inside game, the success is an inside job, is the line I use. You're going to be much better at it if you think of it as an audience of one. And then you follow from that the idea that there's no such thing as public speaking. There's just speaking. So those two go hand in hand. And those are the first two steps to joy. And I think members of your audience might relate to that. I think a lot of people change their mindset a little bit just from hearing those ideas, those concepts, that it's always an audience of one, and there's no such thing as public speaking. There's just speaking. And if you think about those two things, that helps to get better at it, because people, I think, are naturally pretty engaging when they're comfortable being themselves in front of an audience, when they're comfortable just being who they are. That helps a lot for them to become better. And another step, and again, I don't think I should go through all 7. People need to have something to read the book, for. You need to have a few things I leave out from this interview to go take a look in the book. But the audience supports you is another mindset shift that I think is so important. It's something I remind myself about when I give a talk. The audience supports the speaker. The audience wants the speaker to do well. The audience wants the speaker to feel comfortable. The more comfortable you are, the more comfortable the audience will be. So this idea is almost repeat to yourself like a mantra, that the audience supports you. That can help immeasurably to feel more comfortable about speaking to an audience, whether it's 10 or 100 or 1,000. It's the audience supports the speaker. That opens up the space for you to be much more comfortable and actually begin to experience the joy of speaking. Because again, we enjoy speaking to people. We enjoy having conversations most of the time. And sometimes there are difficult conversations that we don't enjoy, but most of the time we like talking to people. That it goes back to who we are as human beings. We go back to one of the great gifts of the species, Homo sapiens. One of our great gifts is being able to communicate and being able to talk. And so that's something that separates us from a lot of other animals. That's what is a basic human skill that we have. And I think people who are able to fulfill that skill or fulfill that particular capability and do it well actually have the experience of joy. They're happy. They're happier people because it's a personal empowerment tool that we have. It's a skill of personal empowerment, being able to speak to other people, whether it's an audience of many or just your friend from down the street or your childhood friend. It's something that makes you more human, it's more empowering just to feel that ability to communicate effectively.
That's great. That's really great. And in the case of, let's say, many people who like stutter have a speech impediment, they feel afraid and intimidated by public speaking situations, but sometimes they don't talk altogether, even if it's with one more person,
Right.
with one colleague, with one friend. They are so scared of talking, of like speaking altogether, that they really like avoid any type of verbal communication.
Right. No, I understand that.
Yeah. So in this case, how do you think we can find the joy of public speaking despite the challenge of like stuttering?
Right. Well, I think it's a particular issue, and but one thing I think people with some kind of impediment might want to think about, first of all, is you're not alone. You're not alone in fearing public speaking. It's a widespread fear. So the idea that a lot of people feel uncomfortable So you're again, you're not alone. This is something that a lot of people have to deal with, whether it's a stuttering issue or just feeling self-conscious or for whatever reason feeling stage fright or trepidation. I like to use the line that some of the ideas in the book and some of the ideas in my workshops will help people get from or turn stage fright into stage delight. And so turning stage fright into stage delight is something that is not unique to people who have an impediment. It's something that is pretty universal. That this fear of stage fright is fairly common. You can also draw some inspiration, I think, from, I guess, one of the more famous stutterers in the world today is President Joe Biden in the United States. He's famous, quite famous, because he's been very open about it, that he stutters. He has a stuttering problem. He's always had a stuttering problem from childhood. And he has worked to deal with it. And so it is possible to become president where you speak to thousands frequently and yet have this stuttering problem. And I think he's been able to do it through all kinds of coaching and training and certain changing of his mindset about it. I think that some of what I've already talked about can be helpful. The idea that the audience supports you, or that if you have the idea that there's support, whether it's with a friend one-on-one or just any conversation, that there's support for you, that can help. And you can, and another step to joy that I didn't touch on is you make sure the real you shows up. If you have a impediment or a stutter, that is you, that's part of you. You don't want to necessarily hide that. Now, if you can give a speech and not stutter, that's fine. But let's say you're giving a speech and you find yourself feeling self-conscious or maybe stutter a little bit. That's you. And if the audience supports you, and if you want to make sure the real you shows up, don't worry so much about that. Don't worry, that is just you. You could say something about your stuttering issue that you've been dealing with. You could say that. I'm not sure you even have to, but you should not feel that that's such a barrier, because the audience supports you. And if that's the real you, I think you can just sort of move on from that. People will get that maybe you have a stutter. I don't think they're going to hold that against you. And they're going to probably feel much more sympathetic toward you. So it's something that if you allow yourself to be a little bit vulnerable in front of an audience, a little bit of just who you are, that can help you gain the courage that you need to get up and speak. And a lot of what this book is about, The Joy of Public Speaking, is to encourage people to get up and speak, to empower people to speak, whether they've remained silent because of a stutter, an impediment, or just shyness, or some other barrier that they felt psychologically about getting up and speaking. I encourage people to break through that. And because I think the world needs more people who maybe have remained silent for many years, who have great ideas or have a contribution to give. If they feel empowered to get up and speak and move an audience and convince them about their cause or their something they feel very passionate about, I think that's a good thing. If you look at the world today, we've got a lot of problems, a lot of crises. We need more people to get involved in the solutions. So in a lot of ways, whether it's climate change or coronavirus or all kinds of things going on in the world, we need more people. It's like all hands on deck to get up and make a difference in the world. So I like to encourage people to feel more empowered, and whether it's a stutter or some other impediment or some other feeling like, I would be embarrassed or I don't want to do that, I encourage people to get up and work on it and break through those barriers, just like Joe Biden did.
I think we should be courageous to confront our fear, specifically of like public speaking. But it's very challenging because when you are self-conscious that you are blocking, that you are like stuttering, and sometimes you see people's expression of looking at you a bit like they don't really understand what is going on. It can really create a lot of more like stress because you are thinking,
Right.
how is this person judging me right now? And that kind of thought can really put a lot of pressure, and the pressure makes it worse for you to like speak. So it can be very challenging. But from your experience, what have you seen as the biggest challenge in public speaking, and how can we overcome it, particularly in this case, if you have a speech impediment?
Well, believe me, I've not experienced a speech impediment myself, so I don't want to minimize what people might go through if they have a stutter. I'm just pointing out that there are ways to deal with it, and you can use role models and examples like Joe Biden and others, and you can think differently about it, and that might help. If, again, reading some parts of the book and maybe doing workshops, and maybe getting some professional assistance coaching, one-on-one coaching can be helpful to make sure that you're able to face the issues that you're talking about, because it's not going to be necessarily simple, although I do think that there is a good deal that people can do to make it easier on themselves if they can prepare themselves mentally. I created, in the book, I talk about creating a speaking sanctuary, where you go into a meditative state, and you create a kind of a safe environment. Close your eyes, you create a safe environment. Maybe it's a something that, a beautiful scene like a mountain meadow, or in my case, I like to think where I grew up in Northern California, the ocean, right in the San Francisco area, the waves crashing on the rocks, and the seagulls flying overhead, and the seals are making noises, and you can go into this kind of a comfort zone, a speaking sanctuary, and you can remind yourself of some of the key points that I've talked about. Always speak to an audience of one. You can write down a few affirmations before you speak and get yourself into the right mental state. Make sure the real you shows up, the audience supports me. Those sorts of reminders, you can do that in almost an instant. Conjure up that speaking sanctuary and get yourself in the right frame of mind, so that perhaps you can avoid the incident or the stutter that might make you feel self-conscious. You might be able to avoid that completely when you give your talk. If you're giving an hour-long talk, it might be harder, but if you're just giving a 5-minute talk, it might be something you could manage, and just get the right frame of mind. And I think that could be helpful. But then if something does come up where you feel a little bit self-conscious, I think it's also true that you can remind yourself again that the audience supports you, and the audience almost invariably will rally in support of someone who might be having, whether it's a stutter or some sort of a block. Sometimes people have they forget what they were going to say. And the audience will almost always accept that and be supportive. I think that's the frame of mind that you should have. Some people might say, well, that may not be true. What if the audience doesn't support me? And I always say, well, what's the best attitude to take to this situation? What is the best mental attitude for you to have? That the audience supports you or the audience doesn't support you? I would argue on behalf of the idea that the audience supports you. That's a better, more empowering mental state to have when you go to give a speech. The audience supports you much better because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think the audience is hostile or doesn't support you, then that's a recipe for disaster. So you don't want to think that way. You want to think more positively. Just like athletes don't go into I play tennis, don't go into a tennis match thinking it's hopeless. There's no way I can beat this other player, or, you have to be thinking, I have a chance. I can do this. Otherwise, you go do something else. You don't compete at that level. So I do think that some of these ideas, because of so much of speaking to audiences is a challenge that goes on between the ears, I think it's important to go through these exercises, mental exercises, a speaking sanctuary, having the right frame of mind, shifting the mindset. I talk about practicing, you've probably heard of jujitsu. Jujitsu is the Japanese martial art that's famous for, not, so you don't go using force against your opponent. You sort of use your opponent's strength against him or her, and you sort of move and shift a little bit away from and use their strength against them. So I like the idea of jujitsu, and I've coined the phrase, the gentle art of mental joy jitsu, not jitsu, but joy jitsu. So it's joy. And if you think about joy jitsu in speaking context, it's a gentle art of just shifting your mindset, just like you would if you're practicing the martial art of jujitsu. It's a different approach. So I suggest a different approach to speaking, in which you accept the possibility of joy and you shift your mindset so that in several areas, your mindset becomes conducive, encourages this idea of joy. And that's the gentle art of mental joy jitsu.
How would you define what is a good public speaker? Like what is a good public speaking? Because is this just like, what are the components? Like, is this just being fluent in your speech? Is it being empathic? Is it being charismatic? Is it being very clear about what you're saying? Is it knowing very well your topic? What
Right.
is it like, okay, this is a good public speaker? How would you define that?
Well, this is interesting because so far been talking about the inside game, the mental aspect of getting that right. And I think that has to come first, getting the mental side, the mindset, to accept the possibility of experiencing joy. And some of those aspects are the inside job, the mental aspects. The book and my workshops also deal with what I refer to as the outside game. You might think of as more the performance aspects of public speaking. And you're touching now a little bit on the performance side. How do you make the speech work? How does it, how do you make it effective? How can you be persuasive? And what is it that you need to do from a performance point of view. And I have many tips about that. I won't go through them, but I have at the end of the book what I call the 20 terrific tips for top-notch talks. That's a lot of alliteration, a lot of T sounding words to get attention, but 20 terrific tips for top-notch talks. It starts with every speech should be about one thing. And so I would say that a good speech, a really effective speech, really covers one topic and maybe some aspect of that topic. You can't talk about the whole topic. Let's say you're going to give a talk about climate change. I mentioned that before. You can't spend hours talking about everything there is to talk about climate change. You have to talk about a certain aspect of it, a certain area of expertise that you have, and you come at climate change from the point of view of a certain area. So you narrow the speech down and you make it clear to the audience before they get there, or once they're sitting there listening to you. You can explain what it is that you're going to talk about for 10 minutes or ideally not much more than 20 minutes. If you have a longer speech, then you have to kind of find ways to break it up and not bore people, because there's something called the 18-minute wall. You've probably heard of TED Talks. They have a rule that it has to be 18 minutes and you can't speak longer than that. And a lot of really good speeches, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, I think was about 17 minutes. A famous history-making speech, only 17 minutes. A lot of speakers think they need to speak for an hour or two. Rethink that, if you rethink how long you should speak to be effective. Now, some programs, if you speak at a conference and you have an hour slot, you have to think about how you fill up that hour. Maybe it's 45 minutes, you take questions, maybe you make sure there's interaction with the audience, maybe you show a little video. You don't just speak for 45 minutes straight, because that can be real boring to most audiences. So you have to find ways to break it up. But I would say there are tips, there are suggestions like every speech should be about one thing, and then how you perform your speech, which also goes into some of the 20 tips. If you're using a prepared text, for instance, or extensive notes, it really helps to stay in connection with the audience as much as possible. Stay in connection, eye contact. And in the 7 Steps to Joy, I talk about making sure you're listening to the audience with your eyes. There's a line in Shakespeare, one of his sonnets, he talks about to hear with eyes belongs to love's fine wit. It's something that if you're really engaged with a member of the audience, with the audience, one-on-one, you're going to be listening, you're going to be paying attention, and you do that through eye contact. And that's one effective way to make sure the audience stays engaged and interested in what you have to say. If you spend a lot of time looking at your notes or your speech, and you're looking down, like if I'm looking down here, speaking this way, and then only occasionally look up to make sure the audience is still there, or just to see if they're still awake, that's not a good speech. So there are ways to make the speech more effective just by staying connected with the audience. So you look down at your script, but you don't say a word. You look down, and then you come up and you speak the line that you just read to a member of the audience. And if there are 100 people, you pick someone out and you talk to that one person. And by connecting with one person at a time, not the same person the whole speech, but one person at a time and another person, the whole audience sees that you're connecting with them. And they take it personally if you don't. They take it personally if you're not connecting. So speak about one topic, connect with the audience, one person at a time. And there are some other tips, but there are ways to get much better at this, the performance aspects of it, through some tips and suggestions that I also go through in my book. I have something called the power of speech, which is one of the first things I came up with when I started coaching. And the power of speech is an acrostic. I don't know if I can actually show it to you. This is a graphic from the book, and maybe people can read this. That's the power of speech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can
I
see.
won't go through all of that, but people can get an idea. Maybe they can freeze this frame or something, and they can get an idea. A good speech has a strong start. It starts with the letter S. A good speech starts strong. How do you do that? Starting with a personal story is always a great way to start a speech, or maybe a surprising fact, cite something, a statistic that might get people's attention. I mean, a personal story I might just mention to you because I mentioned to you, I said earlier that I would tell you about how I got into being a self-help author. And there's a personal story involved in that I often talk about when I give a talk, because it's quite powerful, I think. When you start a personal story, you don't necessarily say what I just did. I don't say this is a powerful story or anything. You just say that you just start the story. So here's how I would just start the story. I would say, I made a promise to my mother on her deathbed that I would finish writing a book that she had been encouraging me to write, and I would dedicate it to her memory. And she looked up at me and said, Matthew, you do that. You do that. And tears in her eyes and tears in my eyes. And I knew I had to fulfill that promise. I'd made a promise to my mother. And I'm happy to say I wrote the book that we had talked about, and I dedicated it to her memory. Usually, when I tell the story, I get a little choked up. The audience gets a little choked up. I don't tell the story to get them choked up. I just tell the story because the book that I promised I would write was a self-help book about habits of success and habits of failure. And I had this idea that, and I won't go into it now, but I had this idea that there are 7 letters in the word failure, and there's 7 letters in the word success. And so I created side by side acrostics. For every failure habit, there's an equal but opposite habit of success. I told my mother about that idea. No one else had ever thought of it that I know of, that you could have these 2 powerful words as 2 powerful acrostics. So she kept encouraging me to write the book. And I would say, well, I'm not a self-help author. I'm a speechwriter. I've written books about European politics, but it's not really what I do. But the more she told me I should do it, the more I thought about it. And when she was sick with cancer, I thought, what can I give my mother? What can I give myself? It's kind of an interesting, when you make a promise like that, it's how much is it a gift to the person you're making the promise? How much is it a gift to yourself? I'm not quite sure. I think it's both. But making a promise like that, I thought would make her happy. And it did. In fact, she said, I'm very happy that you made this promise. And so I knew I had to keep the promise. And I did, and that launched me into this area of writing self-help books. And so the second book is the one that you've seen, and I've updated it as The Joy of Public Speaking. That's the second book. And the third book in my trilogy, I call it, is a book about the power of promises. Because I reread the dedication I wrote for my mother, and it talks about the power of making a promise in the dedication. And so that's what I have set out to do with this, the power of making a promise topic. I had a chance to talk with someone named Jack Canfield. You may know the name, you may not. Jack Canfield is the co-creator of the Chicken Soup for the Soul books that a lot of people have heard about. I think they've sold about 500 million copies. I should be so lucky. They have sold many chicken soup books and lots of different topics. But the original creator of that, Jack Canfield, has written a very powerful foreword to my book about the power of a promise. And so that's another book down the road. So because of the promise I made to my mother, maybe 20 years ago, I've ventured into this whole realm of writing self-help books, which was not what I thought I was going to be doing with the least part of my life. I hadn't even thought about it. But there's something about this idea, and it's funny, where do ideas come from? And why did I get this idea about failure and success being 7-letter words? Somehow I got that idea. My mother was there to encourage me, and the rest, I guess, is history. But it's the promise. That's personal story, a motivating story. Anytime you give a talk, the audience is actually quite interested in, what are you doing here as the speaker? Why are you here? Why are we here? What's the importance of this? So I encourage people, don't be shy about telling your own story, whether it's about NATO or any other cause that you might want to be talking about. What is it about this topic that you're passionate about, and why? And you can do it in 30 seconds. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn out 20 minutes, story. It can be my story about my promise to my mother. That's about 30 seconds. But that's what people remember. And people are going to remember stories that touch the heart. And if you can mention a promise in your story, if there is a promise involved, a promise comes from the heart. And a poet named Samuel Coleridge said, what comes from the heart goes to the heart. And so if you can talk about something from the heart, even if it's about NATO strategy, even if it's about some kind of topic that you might not think going to touch anybody's, why is this important? Why am I here talking about NATO strategy? Why is, if you can touch on that and talk about a story that relates to your presence and your passion for that topic, that will move an audience because it goes right to the heart.
And where can we find your book? Where can we buy your book?
A paperback edition has been published. It's on Amazon, and it should be available, in anywhere on Amazon. France, EU, I think UK, Amazon.com. It should be available on all of the Amazon marketplaces in the world. It's The Joy of Public Speaking. Find your voice, and what's the subtitle? Find your voice and reach your full potential. So your peak potential. So the idea is reach your peak potential as a human being. That's what this is about. It's reaching, if you hold yourself back and you don't get up and speak, use that power of speech, which is a uniquely powerful thing as people, I think you hold yourself back and you feel diminished and you feel disempowered. So whether it's a stutter or some other thing that might prevent you from getting up and speaking, joy of public speaking is all about finding your voice and reaching your peak potential as a person. And that's, so you want to look for that and make sure it's, my name, Matthew Casalato, as the author. There are lots of books out there about speaking. So this is the one that really touches on what I think is the most important aspect, is tap into the joy of public speaking, tap into that happiness to share an idea, to share your passion, to move an audience, to do something that you want them to support. There's something I write about in the book, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but I call it the Wizard of Oz formula. And a lot of people know about the story about the Wizard of Oz, the movie. There are lots of books, Wizard of Oz. Hopefully your audience will know about the Wizard of Oz. But there are three characters in the Wizard of Oz. And this goes to the question of what's an effective speech? And I talked about a few things, the idea is you should start strong, talk about one thing, stay connected with the audience. But there are three ideas here that every speech should touch on. I call it the Wizard of Oz formula because there are three characters in the Wizard of Oz. Everyone, I think, remembers the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion. Those are probably familiar to people with different languages. Hopefully they know these references. The Scarecrow was looking for brains. He thought he needed brains, right? He wasn't smart enough. The Tin Man thought he needed a heart. He wasn't emotional enough. He was metallic and he wasn't emotional. And the Cowardly Lion was seeking courage. I believe that every speech should touch on those three things. It should have brains, it should have information, it should have details, data. It should have something that people can learn about that's objective. But it should also touch on emotion. We talked about this, a story goes to the heart. A powerful speech, like I mentioned, the I have a dream speech, that's not, I have a dream. That's not something that is objective, factual. Yes, he has a dream. What is the dream? It's all about emotional, the way we want to treat other people, the way we want to be in the world. I have a dream is not factual, it's emotional, and that can move people to adopt the dream. And that speech has helped change the world in many ways. So a speech has to have emotional content. And I think when you asked what do a lot of speeches lack, I think they lack that emotional content. They think that the facts speak for themselves, and a lot of people speak just about the facts, but I encourage people to branch out and touch the heart, at least with a personal story, and ask people to go beyond the facts. The third thing is courage. And if the speaker can show courage, and whether you have a stutter or some other impediment or some other reason not to get up and speak, if you show courage, people respond to that. If you ask the audience to show courage, to go out and do something and make a difference in the world, audiences love that. So I have a dream is a challenge to people to adopt the same dream. He wasn't just saying I have a dream and go about your business. he said, I want you to adopt my dream. My dream is your dream. My dream is the dream of the country about all men are created equal. All men, all people are created equal. That's the dream, that we're all equal and we should live out this creed of the United States and treat everybody equally. So that's the dream that, if you can get people to show courage. So I think every speech should have those three elements: brains, information, logic, emotion, touch people from your heart to their heart, and show courage, whether you can show it by speaking about a topic that may not be all that popular or may be very popular. But if you show courage and ask them to show courage, those are three elements that every speech should have.
Thank you, Matthew. That's amazing. Yes, definitely. I think with these three things, we can definitely become good like communicators. I think courage is very important, and I think sharing a personal story makes us more vulnerable, more human. And
Yes,
everyone is going through something, so everyone can somehow relate to you, in your
right,
challenge, in your like struggle, even if they have a different like struggle, but everyone is going through something that we don't know about. So I think
exactly.
when you share something personal that makes you more human, people can usually relate to that. So that's very
Yes,
interesting.
definitely. Yes.
And well, I just wanted to thank you so much again. You know how much I wanted to have you here today talking about the joy of public speaking, because it's such an important topic. And
Show it again. I,
yes,
I'm not shy about showing it. There it
yes,
is.
learn more
It's a
about.
bright and the smiley face. It's all about changing your mindset about public speaking.
Yeah, and this is something that changing our mindset about public speaking, particularly if you stutter, it's something that is very important. Something that we need to do, and it's very challenging to change our shift and the way that we see speaking in general, let alone like public speaking, which is something that we are so like afraid of. So I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing about your book and your all of your experience in public speaking. It's so nice to see you also, even though we
Very
were
nice.
far away. I
Very nice to see
last time
you.
that we saw each other was probably 2 years
Two
ago.
years, maybe 2 years. Yeah, in Brussels.
In
Yeah,
Brussels.
yeah.
So it's nice to.
Well, it's a real pleasure. I really thank you for inviting me, and I hope some of these ideas will do some good. I'm I'm excited and passionate about sharing the ideas in the book and the ideas I share in my workshops and my talks. So every little bit helps to get the word out. So I really appreciate your doing that.
Thank you so much again, Matthew,
Thank you.
and I hope to see you soon. I will keep you posted.
Yeah, keep me posted. Let's stay in touch and good luck and all the best to you. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you to you too.
Yes.
Have a great day and a great weekend.
Great weekend to you. Okay. Thank you. Bon weekend. See
Thank you.
you.
Bon weekend. Bye bye.
Bye. Bye bye.